Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hi, I'm your host, Dawn Cornegas, and joining me to introduce today's podcast is a man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the double secret selection committee that selects all the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hello, Don. Great to be here. Our interview today is with Dr. Vyvyane Loh, a board-certified physician in obesity and internal medicine. She is the founder and leader of Transform Alliance for Health, a Boston-based preventive-care practice that specializes in weight management and the treatment of chronic metabolic diseases, such as diabetes, hypertension, and dyslipidemia.
And Vyvyane has spent her medical career developing expertise in immunology, metabolic syndrome, fat metabolism, clinical nutrition, and preventive medicine. So after graduating from Boston University and rising to become a chief resident, she enrolled in the writing program at Warren Wilson College in North Carolina in 1999 and spent the next 2 years writing a historical novel, Breaking the Tongue. Set in Singapore during World War II, her book was nominated for the prestigious International Impact Award in Fiction and was selected by the New York Public Library as one of its top 25 books of 2004. Before we get to our interview with Vyvyane, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews. As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and other podcast apps for the wittiest, most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review comes from a listener named Emily. The review is titled, Lost 40 Pounds. The review reads, Hi, I've been listening to your podcast. I've been following the ketogenic diet for 18 months now and have lost 40 pounds. It was 50, but I have had a bit of a relapse. I stopped my daily tracking, so my macros may have been off. I will get back on that. I just wanted to say thanks for all you do.
Well, thank you so much, Emily, and congratulations. And thank you to all of our other STEM Talk listeners who have helped STEM Talk become such a great success.
Before we get to our interview with Vyvyane, I'd like to put in a word for an upcoming virtual conference called Targeting Metabesity. The aim of this conference, which is set for October 10th to 13th, is to draw attention to the growing evidence that the major chronic diseases of the day, like cardiovascular disease and neurodegenerative diseases, as well as obesity and cancer, share common metabolic roots and therefore may share common solutions. If you are interested in more information about the conference, as well as a free registration code that is being offered to STEM Talk listeners, visit the STEM Talk homepage at stemtalk.us, where you will find the show notes for today's interview with Vyvyane Loh. And there you will find a link and instructions on how to receive a code for complimentary admission to the conference. In terms of my participation in the conference, I am moderating a session on emerging research related to endogenous and exogenous ketosis in health and disease, as well as the role of ketones in mild traumatic brain injury and ketones in cancer. If you have enjoyed the interviews we've had on STEM Talk with Dr. Stephen Ostad, Colin Champ, James Kirkland, John Newman, Brianna Stubbs, Jeff Volek, and my colleague Morley Stone, who are all speaking at the conference, you should find the talks by the other 70 speakers quite interesting and beneficial. So visit Vyvyane's show notes on the STEM Talk homepage, where you will find a link for the complimentary admission code to the conference, and this will be a savings of $149. Okay, and now on to our interview with Dr. Vyvyane Loh.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hi, welcome to STEM Talk. I'm your host, Dawn Cornegas, and joining us today is Vyvyane Loh. Vyvyane, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And also joining us is Ken Ford.
Hello, Don, and hello, Vyvyane.
Hi.
So, Vyvyane, just to get started, I've read several interviews about you, and they all describe how writing and dance have been passions of yours since you were a child. So when did you become interested in science?
Oh, well, I think in school we had a very strong science curriculum. I grew up in Singapore. And so I don't know if I was interested in science. It was just something you did every day. I think it was really when I came here for my university education that I started to look at science in a different way and started to get more curious about it. So I would say rather late.
Yeah. And then how did you end up in the States attending Boston University?
Well, I had completed my A-levels. And at the time, both my brothers were starting college. They're both younger than I am, and they just completed their O-levels. And I didn't know at the time you could just do your O-levels and come here. But when I found that they were going to university in the States, where I thought there would be better heating than England, where I had been for my A-levels, I jumped ship and came right away with them.
So you came to Boston for improved heating? Is that what you said? Heating, like as warmth?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Deranged. I know. But that tells you, I mean, I grew up in the tropics, so I knew nothing about, winter. And what I had experienced in England really was very much nothing compared to what I saw in Boston.
Well, you went on to earn degrees in biology and the classics, which seems like a lovely but unusual double major. How did that come about?
That was mostly because in my first semester, I realized quickly that there weren't a lot of options for me in terms of courses for biology. I ended up taking a lot of independent studies for biology just because I had placed out of many of the basic courses due to the A-levels. And then I had this moment where I realized I'm going to spend 4 years and not learn anything. And that terrified me. So I thought that I would just pick something else when I discovered that you could double major. I was thrilled and I thought I'll just pick something that I know nothing about. And that way I will get something out of my 4-year education. So I looked through the course catalog and came to classics and thought, yep, know nothing about this, don't know Latin, don't know Greek, that should do. And I marched up to the classics department to see if I could be a classics major.
And they were pleased to meet someone who wanted to do that.
I don't know. My professor, he was also my advisor, Steve Scully. He just saw me, I think, as another pre-med student at the time. And he said, oh, okay, classics, well, you'll do Latin. And I said, well, no, I was hoping to do Greek. And he said, no, Latin, you're pre-med. And I said, Greek. And he kept saying Latin, which made me now adamant about doing Greek. Right? So we had this Greek, Latin. I think it probably went on for a half hour, but I persisted, wore him down, and he approved of my Greek courses. And I did do Latin later.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're a classics major, you should probably do both, really.
Yeah. So
Steve, he's got a connection to Seaside, a town here very near IHMC.
Yeah, I just discovered that very recently.
And what is the connection?
Well, his father was Vince Scully, very famous art historian at Yale. And it turns out that the developers of Seaside were students of his and sort of wanted to honor him, and I think they've put up some memorial.
Yes, at his passing, they put up a memorial, but he had a substantial influence in the thinking of, particularly of Robert Davis.
I see.
So we're going to switch a little bit away from your background, Vyvyane, and kind of start talking about the science that's associated with the work that you do. So most folks will assume that thin people are healthy and that overweight people are not so healthy. Yet there's a term that you refer to called TOFI, which stands for thin outside, fat inside. That is used to describe thin individuals with a disproportionate amount of fat or adipose tissue that's stored in their abdomen. So can you talk a little bit about TOFI and then what you referred to as normal weight obesity?
Yeah. So, I think most people would assume that my patients, they could be identified visually in terms of their obesity. But it turns out that a good number of my patients actually have this phenotype of looking thin, looking as if they don't have a weight problem, and they may not have a weight problem, but they still may have a metabolic problem in the sense that they have increased fat mass and dysfunctional fat in their bodies. So we think of obesity often as an increase in fat mass. And I think what's not often discussed is that we should be looking at fat function as well. And if the fat is sick, so to speak, then that person could well have metabolic dysfunction in the fat tissue. So when I see these patients, and they're typically, maybe their BMIs are 27, 25 even, or could be completely normal BMI below 25. If you do a DEXA scan, you will be able to see that they have increased visceral deposits of fat, and that obviously predisposes them to, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, stroke, hypertension, that kind of thing. So these people are the ones that tend to be missed in terms of risk stratification, just because by the eyeball test, they look normal and they look healthy. But if you were to do a body composition, you'd see a different story.
Mm-hmm. This whole TOFI phenomena that you've discussed really helps to highlight the shortcoming. And I think it's a considerable shortcoming of the BMI method. I mean, it's a very simplistic method, just relating height to weight. And consequently, you'll have people with, as you just mentioned, with perfectly normal BMIs who are in fact in bad shape. A lot of fat deposits where they don't need to be. And you'll see people that are lean and strong with high BMIs. Weightlifters, athletes often are obese or borderline obese on the BMI test, even though they're very lean. So it seems relatively useless. I like the use of the DEXA providing a percent body fat and much more information.
Yes, and if you take into consideration ethnic differences as well, then it's even more useless, right? Because for someone of South Asian heritage, so someone from India, for example, a BMI of 25 would put them in the obese range. I'm East Asian, and a BMI of 27 would put someone like me in the obese range. And that would be still in the overweight range if you use the standard classification, right? So, yeah, I much prefer using body composition by DEXA.
I remember a physician telling me I was borderline obese once.
Well, I had a patient with a BMI of 33 and he was all muscle, and
Right.
you do not want that patient to lose weight, or, you'd be making him sicker.
I agree.
Yeah, it makes sense. So, Vyvyane, abdominal or visceral fat is a particular concern because it's a key player in a variety of health problems, much more so than subcutaneous fat. And visceral fat is found deep within the abdominal cavity, where it pads the spaces between our abdominal organs. Can you talk a little bit about how visceral fat is linked to such a wide range of metabolic disorders?
Yeah, well, there's a real difference in the fat tissue that we have depending on the compartments in which they're stored, right? So one big difference would be that in normal fat tissue, which is under the skin, so that would be the subcutaneous fat, these fat cells can multiply and they grow by a process called hyperplasia, which means you have baby fat cells and, now we reproduce and we make more fat cells. And as you're making more fat cells, you also have increased stroma. So you have the supporting tissue like blood vessels and nerves grow together with that fat tissue. Now, tissue inside the abdominal cavity and the visceral components. So visceral fat, usually when you measure it by DEXA, you're looking mostly at omental fat, but it's a subset of ectopic fat, which just means fat where fat tissue should normally not be. So it could be in organs like the heart or the liver or the lungs, anywhere inside the body. So when you have that kind of fat, it actually tends to grow by a process called hypertrophy. So instead of making more fat cells, the pre-existing fat cells tend to swell and increase in size, right? And as that happens, you get a situation where we're not really increasing fat tissue. So you're not getting concurrent increase in vasculature to the fat tissue. And as a result, you will have a lot of this fat tissue under hypoxic conditions, and they start to necrose and die. So you have really stressed fat cells because they're swollen and they're not accessing nutrients and oxygen. And as they start to die, they send out inflammatory signals. And this can have a vast array of metabolic consequences.
With obesity, one also often finds endothelial dysfunction, which can result in the vasculature being inflamed and thereby damaged. As a result, there's often decreased blood flow to the brain. I understand that you find this kind of frustrating because there's a clear-cut association between obesity and decreased brain volume, and yet it really never gets discussed, or very, very rarely. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, not only does it not get discussed, I think we don't associate that with the challenges people have in regulating their behavior around food. So, as you mentioned, there is endothelial dysfunction, and there's clear evidence that there's decreased cerebral blood flow whenever someone has obesity. So, if you see the BMI going up, then you notice that blood flow to global areas of the brain will decrease. And, over a period of time, we then have death of neurons and therefore shrinkage of brain tissue. So we have now brain atrophy, right? And this impacts behavior because people with decreased brain volumes now have increased impulsivity, decreased restraint, challenges with cognitive function, and so forth. And I have lots of really very accomplished and talented individuals who are my patients. And they will say to me, I've done so many things in my life, and yet I can't seem to, get my behavior straight around food. Why do I always choose the wrong things to eat? Why do I always give in to the snacks when I know it's not good for me? And I think this is related to the decreased brain volume, that they have challenges because the brain is struggling as it is with decreased blood flow and also shrinkage of neurons.
What is the association causally, general reduction in brain volume leading to such a specific behavioral problem as difficulty regulating appetite? Is there thought to be a specific part of the brain that's being affected, or what is the connection there?
Well, I think because you have really global decreased perfusion, it impacts functioning across the entire brain, including the prefrontal cortex, all the areas that you require for executive function. And most people will say, I can do a lot of things, but I can't seem to manage my food, for example.
That's the part that I find interesting, that this particular behavioral problem resulting from something as diverse and broad as either volume or perfusion for the brain overall. It's very interesting.
So it's interesting. So the prevalence of metabolic health in American adults is alarmingly low, even in normal weight individuals. And it's been estimated that just 12% of Americans fall into the category of metabolically healthy. And researchers at the University of North Carolina published a study that found just 1 in 8 American adults have optimal metabolic health. And I'm just guessing this finding didn't surprise you.
No, it doesn't. And, again, if you look at the prevalence of obesity, 2018 statistics, right? I think it was 42% in the US. But that's by BMI. And if you were to go by percent body fat, right, then I think it would be much higher. It would be closer to 90%, which matches the amount of metabolic dysfunction we see. So I think people go, well, about 40+% of the population has obesity, but truly it's closer to 90%. And so the problem is much worse than we realize, but we're always just looking at BMI.
Metabolic disease, as you've been describing it, is arguably the greatest epidemic we face in the world today, COVID-19 notwithstanding. I'm curious, what have you learned about metabolic disease in your practice that you didn't learn in medical school or residency? I think probably quite a lot, but I
think everything.
I ask you to tell us.
Pretty much everything I had to learn on my own because, no, it wasn't discussed in medical school. Nutrition is not taught in medical school, right? Any meaningful preventive health curriculum is still non-existent, I think, in the medical curriculum. So all of it had to be learned on the job and just trying to piece things together and figure things out as I was treating patients.
So I'm afraid that this problem has become even worse over the past few years as a partial consequence of the societal response to COVID-19. So at the beginning of the lockdown, when people went into panic mode and wiped out grocery store shelves of all their toilet paper, you noticed that the baking aisle was also completely wiped out. And we know with the rise of anxiety and stress during COVID, many people were using food to relieve their stress. And I understand that you've seen this in your practice. Is that right?
Oh, yes, for sure. I think that it's not conscious, but a lot of people will use food to self-soothe, and most of them won't even notice, right? So when we get them to, let's say, keep a food diary or log all their intake, they suddenly become aware that they've been eating all day. And if they're paying close attention, they may even know that, oh, it's when I talk to my boss or when I'm dealing with a very difficult project or something like that. So there's definitely this association between anxiety, increased stress, and poor behaviors around nutrition.
This is probably a good time to continue to talk about your practice. You branched out on your own in 2015 because you had been working within the medical system and came to the realization that it was very difficult to offer a new way of providing preventative care from within what is essentially a broken system. I would characterize it as not a healthcare system, but a sick care system. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about this a little?
Yeah, I mean, I was just frustrated that there was really not a lot of attention to preventive care and really no meaningful discussion of what that meant and what it meant to keep patients healthy. I don't think there's even a consensus of what health is, right? I mean, I think in the medical world, it's just absence of disease, which is pretty low standard, I think. So if we can't really envision what health is, then I don't think we have a good chance of really promoting health. And when I started my own practice, I was interested in finding a new way to practice medicine, to focus on the preventive aspects, to just take apart what we were doing and look at it, anew, and try to create a new way to deliver healthcare that would be more meaningful and impactful to patients. And also to providers, because I think a lot of the provider burnout is from this sense of, well, we're not really doing anything for these patients, right?
Yeah, futility is definitely a cause of burnout in any field.
Yeah.
So your practice is called the Transform Alliance for Health, and I want to read you something from your website.
Ugh.
So this is in quotes. Chronic stress and emotional issues commonly lead to using food to self-medicate or self-soothe. The visible result, the patient's weight, becomes the focal issue for their healthcare providers. For us, however, it is merely the physical manifestation of the patient's internal struggle with his or her real problem. From this starting point, we work with our patients to uncover their deeper and often more complex reasons for overeating and to take charge of their lives. That's the end of the quote. So can you elaborate a little bit on this statement?
Yeah, I think when you look at patients' charts, right, you usually have a problem list that providers have generated. And, you might see obesity there as something on that problem list. However, my team and I tend to regard obesity not really as a problem, but the patient's solution to a bigger problem. Right? And that bigger problem might be, I hate my job, or I'm not getting on with my children. Could be that I am not dealing with, moving to a new city. Whatever it might be, the solution for the patient then is to self-soothe, as we discussed earlier, and they may use food, they may use alcohol, but then this leads to increase metabolic dysfunction. And that really is what we're seeing. We see now the increased weight, the increased blood pressure, and so forth. But we're not really looking at the patient's real problem and realizing that the behaviors are just the solutions, or they're short-term solutions to the real problems.
Mm. And I listened to an interview with you where you talked about how a ketogenic diet can often reduce inflammation and reverse metabolic disease. But in your practice, I understand that you find it hard to get people to stick to a ketogenic diet. So you instead emphasize going low carb rather than strict ketogenic diet. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, it's, pretty challenging. And most of my patients, they self-identify, many of them self-identify as foodies, and they're reluctant to completely give up carbs, even though I'm mostly stressing that they should give up the processed carbs. Even that is hard sometimes. So it's, I guess the compromise that I make is at least get them off the most processed carbs. Now, the average American eats anywhere between 300 to 400 grams of carbs per day. So our recommendations are below 80, if possible, 80 to 100. So it's a low-carb diet, but, almost no one is doing it.
Well, do you yourself eat a low-carb diet or a ketogenic diet or some variation of that?
Yes, I eat a very boring diet. I pretty much eat the same thing every day, and I don't have any carbs actually in my diet. I mostly eat protein and some vegetables and fat.
So you would be in ketosis then?
I would imagine, yeah. I mean, the few times I've tested, yes, I have been. I don't go around testing myself all day.
Yeah, you have sore fingers if you do.
Yeah.
Did you mentioned that patients often regard themselves as foodies and they're very enthusiastic about food, as am I, by the way. So they must not want to hear it when you tell them to give up carbs. Is you telling your patient things they don't want to hear a big part of what you do?
It's 100% of what I do. I always say my full-time job is telling people things they don't want to hear. Right?
Wow.
Full-time job.
I hope that doesn't carry into all aspects of your life.
No, I hope not. But pretty much with my patients, yes, because, I will say this. There's such a delicate dance, I think, that providers do around weight. They're reluctant to bring up the subject. They're reluctant to bring up obesity because they don't want to be seen as fat shaming. They don't want to, make their patients feel bad. And I totally agree with that. I don't think anyone should be shamed. However, to ignore the metabolic dysfunction and the dire consequences that could result from that, I think would really be malpractice, in my opinion, because, you're watching this person go under and you're not doing anything about it, right? So it's really this ability to say the truth, tell patients things they don't want to hear, but get them to a place where they can hear it, right? And then maybe start to work with them on rectifying some of these problems.
I can see how that would be tricky, particularly in today's society where any offense is blown into a major offense.
That's right, and you can't tell. I mean, it gets to a point where you can't tell people. I think it would be kind of akin to not telling people that they may have a cancer or something, right? Because that might upset people.
Right.
And would that be the right thing to do? Absolutely not.
Well, they could go to a safe space.
Okay. And I hope the safe space will allow for proper treatment of their disease, right? But, I think avoidance is really not the solution.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, agree. A little bit of a shift. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is today one of the most common maladies in the United States. And actually 30 to 40% of adults in this country have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So Vyvyane, can you discuss non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and then what you see as its causes and also most efficacious treatments?
Yeah, well, it's even worse, I think, in the diabetic population. Pretty much every diabetic I see, I just assume they have fatty liver, right? And they're unaware of it. I spoke to a gastroenterologist once, and he just said, please don't refer these patients with fatty liver to me. Everyone has it. And he's swamped. And I can understand. So with fatty liver, unfortunately, a proportion of these people will also develop hepatitis, which is an inflammation in the liver. Now, when you look at it histologically, you can't differentiate between fatty liver from obesity and fatty liver from, let's say, alcohol. But, you go by history. So if you say Joey has a BMI of 50, then, okay, that's fatty liver from obesity. Joey's been drinking hard liquor for 50 years. Well, that's likely alcoholic, right? But really, the sequence is still the same. With fatty liver, it can develop into hepatitis, and then that can go on with increased fibrosis to cirrhosis and complete scarring of the liver, which also increases your risk of liver cancer, right? And prior to, this really explosion in obesity, we used to worry about infectious causes of hepatitis like hep C and also alcoholic hepatitis. And they were the main drivers for liver transplantation in patients. But by 2030, it really will be obesity that will be driving the need for liver transplantation, particularly in women.
So now when a patient comes to you, you'll do an evaluation of their metabolic health, which makes sense based off of everything we've been talking about. And this, I understand, involves coming up with an insulin resistance score for patients, which takes into account C-peptide. And you'll also do an advanced lipid panel. So can you talk a little bit about these markers and then the other metabolic markers that you look at when you're evaluating a patient?
Yeah, again, I think we're used to using something like the A1C, which looks at glucose levels in the blood. But by the time you see dysfunction there in terms of high blood sugar levels, that's really quite far downstream, right? And if you want to have a true preventive approach, you have to look at something else. So insulin is much more useful, I think, in predicting whether they're going to develop metabolic syndrome or whether they have metabolic syndrome. So if they're running around with a high insulin resistance score, it doesn't matter what the blood glucose is. They basically have hyperinsulinemia and likely insulin resistance, and they're at high risk for all the metabolic disorders. So we definitely will check insulin, and we will look at the advanced lipid panel as well, because there's this obsession, I think, with cholesterol. Generally, what patients come to me with would be a standard lipid panel from their primary care offices. And that really doesn't help me much because it's, just the total cholesterol with some LDL levels, HDL, and maybe triglycerides. And the goal, obviously, as you well know, is to get the LDLs as low as possible. And there's no stratification in terms of, do they have the more atherogenic types of LDLs? What are their levels of inflammation, for example, right? So we're not really looking at a more in-depth analysis of the lipid panel.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
You offer curriculums and programs for your patients, and I understand that you talk to them about the importance of sleep and mobility and strength training because, and I think I'm quoting you here, I want my patients to press the reset button and get back to their factory settings because we've messed up their factory settings. Can you give our listeners a sense of how you go about helping people reboot and return to their factory settings?
Okay. I don't know where you dug that from, but definitely I would be focusing on their nutrition, right? Most people are not aware of the double burden of obesity. And that would be that while they may suffer from increased fat mass, they also, in the same patient, you'll often see nutrient deficiencies, right? And that's because their diets may be calorically rich, but nutrient deficient. So that's one aspect that I focus on. And then, of course, sleep is a big component of metabolic health. So I generally give a 1 to 1.5 hour class on sleep. And we really try to help patients adhere to a good sleep hygiene protocol. We also work on exercise because, as you well know, Ken, there's decreasing muscle mass as people age. And that too is often not picked up. And, it's not being addressed, I think, by the medical world. I mean, if you look at people with obesity, especially, right, they tend to have sarcopenic obesity. But you're never going to suspect it because you look at someone and they don't look like they're sarcopenic. They just don't look like it. And if they go from a BMI from 35 to 30, you still would not suspect that this person may be losing muscle mass, because they just don't look that way. And that's also very true in cachectic patients. So if you start off with a patient who has a high BMI and then they get cachexia, you're never going to pick that up because they lose some weight. They go from BMI 36 to 32. They lost some weight, but no one would suspect that they might be cachectic. So I think we miss out on opportunities to treat patients at that point.
Yeah, and you talked about sleep, and we recently had Greg Potter, which was up on episodes 136 and 137, and Jeff Iliff on the podcast to talk about the importance of sleep, and particularly how a lack of sleep can lead to many negative health outcomes. And something that you emphasize is, as you were talking about, is the role of sleep and also nocturnal blood pressure dipping during sleep. So we'd like to know a little bit more about what you mean by nocturnal blood pressure dipping and how a lack of it increases a person's risk for silent strokes as well as kidney dysfunction.
Yeah, so, when you are in non-REM deep sleep, you get to a point where you are at your lowest heart rate and blood pressure for that 24-hour period, right? And that's normal. You should have this dipping in your blood pressure, dipping in your heart rate. But in some populations, you may see blunted dipping. And if you look at those patients, then they actually have increased cardiovascular mortality. So 5% decrease in dipping can translate into a 20% increase in cardiovascular mortality. And that's often not looked at. The other thing I think I want to point out is that with REM sleep, that helps with cognitive functioning and emotional processing. And people who don't get good REM sleep then are not going to make good decisions around behaviors, right, for their health. So those two are related as well. Yeah, and unfortunately, your REM sleep is at the end of your sleep periods, right? So you're closer to the dawn hours. So the early hours of your sleep are mostly the non-REM portions. So if you're sleeping 4 hours, you're getting a lot of non-REM sleep, but you're not getting any REM sleep.
We've been discussing body composition and sarcopenia and cachexia today. And I imagine that when you have a patient, you look into that person's protein intake as a key part of their nutrition pattern. Could you take a moment to discuss protein and share your thoughts on the matter, particularly for the older population that's concerned about sarcopenia?
Yeah. Well, obviously, I always tell my patients, right, if we're trying to increase muscle mass, then you at least have to have the building blocks for muscle, which would be protein. And if you're not taking in sufficient intake, then that's really going to jeopardize you maintaining your muscle mass or even building any. So we know that in older populations that there's actually an increased need because they have anabolic resistance and they tend to be more catabolic, and they also exposed to more catabolic crises. So for example, if they have surgery or they get an infection or they fall and break something, these events tend to be catabolic and they tend to lose muscle mass as they're trying to work through them. So if you're not supporting the patients through adequate protein supplementation, you're going to start losing more muscle. And yes, it is one of the hardest things to do to persuade people who are trying, especially if they're trying to lose weight, to eat more. And we do try to get them to have more meals in the day simply because it's very different if you try to have a huge protein meal, right? You really don't get the same effect by having a huge protein meal once a day as compared to spacing out your proteins appropriately through the day.
I understand and certainly appreciate that one of probably many things that you feel good about and are proud of is getting patients off medications. So people typically come to you with a whole list of medications. Tell me about that and what kind of success you've had.
Yeah, so that is really what got me thinking about preventive health and metabolic health, right? I was approached very early in my career by a bariatric surgeon who wanted me to cover his clinics. And he was a surgeon. He was interested in surgery appropriately. And he wanted to find someone to just, offload, I suppose, his clinics to. And I was happy to do that. And when I first started, I didn't know what I was doing. But one thing I noticed was that patients would require less medication. I would be taking people off insulin, which I had never done in my entire training, never seen that. And it had never occurred to me that I could take someone off insulin, take them off blood pressure medications. So once I got exposed to that, there was no going back. Because now you feel like you're really doing something for the patient. You're really helping them, right? And it made me realize that most of the medications that patients are taking really are helping with the symptoms of the disease and maybe delaying progression, but they're not addressing the root cause.
Right. And this is a great example of how not to have physician-induced futility that we talked about. You don't feel futile when you do something like that.
That's right.
In fact, our mutual friend, Jeff Volek, helped start a company, Virta, that's taken a lot of people off insulin through the use of the ketogenic diet. Given your interest in metabolic health, can you tell us about some of the immune cells involved in regulating metabolic health?
Yeah, so in really teaching myself about metabolic health, I started looking at inflammation and the immune system and the different types of immune cells that populate adipose tissue. So you have a whole range. So, for example, we have these invariant natural killer T cells. T cells, these iNKT cells, they're really part of the lymphoid line, which is part of the adaptive immune system. But these cells in particular have an ability to induce FGF21, which then increases the browning of white fat, right? Which, as you can see, would have metabolic implications. And in fact, if you look at GLP-1 agonists like liraglutide, it's been found that actually upregulates invariant NKT cells in fat tissue. And that might be one of the mechanisms for weight loss in the use of GLP-1 agonists. And then you also have, for example, these ILC2 cells, and these are innate lymphoid cells. They're also, again, lymphoid, so generally thought of as in the adaptive immune system, but these ones really are much more involved in homeostatic regulation of tissue, and they are activated by interleukin 33, and as a result, they then tend to produce these type 2 cytokines that will stimulate macrophages to a more anti-inflammatory phenotype. And then if you look at just cytokines alone, interleukin 33, for example, has the ability to increase browning of white adipose tissue through UCP1 expression. So, when you look at how the immune system is involved in metabolism, really for me, that just puts together two pieces that I love, right? Immunology and metabolism. And there's this really growing field now called immunometabolism that I'm fascinated by.
And I guess this is probably a good time to mention your upcoming IHMC lecture, which, just by the way, will be available on IHMC's website and on YouTube. And I love this. The title of your lecture is On the Magical Mystery Macrophage Tour. And you refer to macrophages as mysterious, specialized cells of innate immunity that play significant roles in really some of our most common medical conditions that range from cardiovascular disease to gastrointestinal disorders to obesity and even to osteoarthritis. So can you explain to our listeners what these cells are and what their various important functions are?
Yeah, so macrophages are part of the immune system. They come from the myeloid line and they're part of the innate system. So we have two arms of the immune system, the innate and the adaptive. And the innate arm is sort of the ready-made arm, and it can respond to stimulation straight away within hours, whereas the adaptive arm tends to take days, maybe weeks to respond, right? And that would be the lymphoid line, the T cells and B cells. And in the innate line, you will have things such as neutrophils and macrophages. And I've just been fascinated by macrophages, which is why I picked that topic for the talk. And it turns out that there's a lot that we don't know about macrophages. So that gave me an opportunity to kind of dig in deep.
How and when did you first become interested in macrophages? Like, what motivated this interest?
It was probably several years ago. What motivated the interest in macrophages? That's a really good question. All I'm thinking of is that 2003 paper that came out that talked about noticing increased macrophages in adipose tissue in obese patients. And that might have got me thinking about macrophages, although I feel like it's probably before then.
Well, that would make sense, though. I mean, that paper I can see how that would stimulate your interests. Macrophages also stand out in a sense because they possess the unique ability to become polarized in response to different environmental stimuli. How does that work, and what's the implication of that?
Yeah, I mean, this polarization thing, I don't think there's anyone who works with macrophages who really likes the M1, M2 polarization terminology, but it is a very useful concept to use. And the idea is that macrophages can have different phenotypes, and two ends of the spectrum would be the M1 or M2 phenotype, the M1 being pro-inflammatory and the M2 being anti-inflammatory. Now, that's a gross simplification, and I don't think that exists really physiologically in any tissue. I think rather you tend to see different subsets of macrophages, and they may have anti-inflammatory and inflammatory components at the same time. So that's where it gets confusing, I think, with macrophage research. And how the macrophages developed, how they came into the tissue is also important. So for a long time, we thought that, macrophages were just bone marrow derived cells and they came from that myeloid line. Monocytes would be rolling around in the bloodstream and then they'd get to a tissue, enter the tissue, and then become either dendritic cells or macrophages.
Yeah,
right?
that's what I have been told.
Yeah, but then we more recently discovered that actually there's a group of macrophages called the tissue-resident macrophages, and they actually come from the embryo. They actually come from yolk sac. So these are cells that are developing with the yolk sac, and even before the development of vasculature and the heart, they are sent so in the case of microglia, which maybe some people don't realize those are macrophages as well. The microglia macrophages are developed from the yolk sac, and they migrate to the neuroectoderm and develop with the central nervous system, right? And at the same time, some of these progenitors may go to other tissue. And then there's a second phase. This is after development of the vasculature. They go to the liver, and from there, they seed other tissue. Now, these tissue-resident macrophages have very different characteristics from those that are monocyte-derived. And it's really only been the last decade, I think, that we've started to explore the differences.
Mm. So macrophages can detect products of bacteria and other microorganisms using a system of recognition receptors, such as toll-like receptors or TLRs. And it would be great if you could explain the role and significance of these receptors.
So when we talk about the innate arm of the immune system, we're really talking about the ready-made arm. So I liken that to retail. If you're out to buy clothes, you walk into a store and you just pick out something in your size, the color you want, and it's ready to go. You can put it on that minute and use it, right? But if you wanted something that was more tailored to your specific needs and your measurements, then you would have to have it measured and custom made. And that would be more like the adaptive arm of the immune system. So macrophages belong in that ready-to-go arm, the innate arm. And cells of the innate arm can recognize these motifs that are present in bacteria and viruses that sort of trigger alarm systems in them and tell them that, there is either a pathogen in the body or some toxic substance that they need to deal with. And they can respond very quickly because they're just responding to these recurring motifs rather than specific antigens. For a long time, they were ignored because there was a lot more interest in the T cells and B cells because, of the complexity in antigen recognition. And I think macrophages was seen as these brute cells that just went around swallowing things and not very interesting and mostly monocyte derived. But recently, there's been a turnaround, and as I said, there's just a lot of subtlety and nuances to macrophages that we didn't realize before.
So Vyvyane, you talked a bit already about tissue-resident macrophages, and it would be great if you could also talk about the diverse roles that TRMs play in many physiological processes, including metabolic function.
So yes, if we look at fat tissue, and even then, there's a lot we don't understand when we look at tissue macrophages in fat. For a long time, we've noticed that there are these crown-like structures that are prominent in adipose tissue in obese individuals. And the more crown-like structures we saw, then the higher the risk for metabolic disease, the higher the risk for inflammation, and so forth. So these crown-like structures are actually macrophages that are devouring or phagocytosing dead fat cells. And they're just doing their function of cleaning up the tissue environment, homeostatic function there. And we used to think that the crown-like structures were from, increased M1 macrophages and more pro-inflammatory cytokines. And it turns out that actually there are these homeostatic macrophages that are trying to clear the debris. And we see that in lean adipose tissue as well as obese adipose tissue. The difference is that you see more, obviously, in the obese tissue, but there's this deficiency somewhat in clearing the apoptotic cells. And it's as if these homeostatic macrophages are struggling to clean up the environment. And as the debris piles up, it creates more and more of an inflammatory environment. That would be one function. But then it gets confusing because a very recent study where they discovered that these tissue-resident macrophages have a role in direct lipid storage in adipocytes. Right? And this is via, in case anyone's interested, is via platelet-derived growth factor C. And part of the homeostatic function is actually storing the fat, right? So, in one case, you can see it's trying to clear away the apoptotic cells, fat cells, but they may also be storing lipids in the adipocytes. So are they helping in cases of obesity? I don't know.
But for most of human existence that evolved
You
us
need
to
it
be
to.
the animal
Yeah.
we are,
Yeah.
you really want
You
it
need
to
it
store
to store, yeah. So that does make sense, right?
It absolutely makes
Right.
sense. Following up on fat tissue, current medical practice still looks at obesity largely through the lens of caloric balance, calories in, calories out, and obviously caloric balance matters. What new discoveries in obesity research, though, broaden the horizon and challenge the narrowness of that dogma?
Yeah, I think the ones that really excited me were the ones around the discovery of SAMs, or sympathetic associated macrophages. Well, first of all, for a long time, we didn't know if sympathetic nerves actually directly innervated fat tissue, right? We thought that this was an action through the systemic circulation, and then norepinephrine would get to fat tissue, and then we would get lipolysis as a result. But now we know that we actually have sympathetic neurons that directly innervate fat tissue. In fact, they are in direct contact with the fat cells themselves, and they are secreting norepinephrine. And in obesity, we have a subset of macrophages that have been called SAMs, sympathetic associated macrophages, that cluster around these synapses. And they sort of are in between the sympathetic nerves and the fat cell. And what happens in obesity is that they are actually taking in the norepinephrine through special transporters. So through the SLC6A2 transporter, they take in the norepinephrine. And they also have monoamine oxidase A in them. So that means they can degrade the norepinephrine. So what's happening is that they're actually taking in the norepinephrine and degrading it, breaking it down. And as a result, the fat cell is not exposed to the norepinephrine. And so we don't get lipolysis as a result. So this was startling because, we'd always just focused on, well, it's what you eat and you should be exercising a certain amount to balance that calorically. But at least at the tissue level, we can see here that the body is responding through this upregulation of these SAMs that are now really blunting the effect of norepinephrine on the fat cells in the case of obesity. They also tend to be, these SAMs tend to be pro-inflammatory, and then they induce an inflammatory environment through the secretion of cytokines as well.
Excellent answer.
Yeah, well, and then, the other discovery that was a bit mind-blowing to me, actually very mind-blowing to me, was also a very recent one, 2021, by Brestoff et al., where they discovered that fat cells are transferring their mitochondria to macrophages, which is sort of, shall we just pause for a second to take that in? Because I had to pause for several hours to take that in. So in normal circumstances, in lean models, they were using mice, we actually have the fat cells transferring mitochondria to macrophages. But in diet-induced obese mice, there is this inhibition of the mitochondrial transfer. And that seems to be related to this development of obesity. So these again, and in those, in that study, he had his mice in metabolic cages, and you could see that they were eating the same as their littermate controls and had the same physical activity levels, but really they were producing less heat right? Less energy expenditure as measured through heat as compared to the glutamate controls. So really this mitochondrial transfer makes a big difference.
Mitochondria seem to pop up all over the place.
Yep, they do.
And so, Vyvyane, your practice and medicine are just one part of your life. Writing and dance and choreography also play major roles in your life. And I understand that you've choreographed an opera. So can you tell us about these aspects of your life outside of the medical work that you do?
That was a while ago. But, I, even as a child, was always in my head, very cerebral and in my head. And I think dance was... my mother introduced me to dance. She brought me to ballet lessons, and I hated it at first. But it's come to be something that I think is just part of my life because it allows me to be in my body. So for someone who's always in her head, having dance forces me to be in my body, to really become embodied, right? And now there isn't a day that goes by that I don't move or dance in some way, even if it's not a formal class. So it's been it's just part of my life. I don't go through a day without dancing, shall we say.
Dawn mentioned, in addition to dance, Dawn mentioned writing, and I'd like to follow up on that. Your novel, which I have, by the way, called Breaking the Tongue, was selected as one of the top 25 books of 2004 by the New York Public Library, and in 2006 was nominated for the International Impact Award, which is an important award. It's perhaps the richest award for a single work of fiction published in English. This novel chronicles the fall of Singapore to the Japanese in World War II. Can you talk a little bit about the book and its primary themes, as well as what possessed you to undertake such a project? Writing a novel is a big undertaking and takes time and commitment.
Well, I'll take that one first. I really, when I started writing, I was mostly writing poetry, right? And most of my undergraduate years, I was working on poetry. And then really when I was in residency, I shifted to fiction, and mostly it was short fiction at the time. And then I had a scholarship to Warren Wilson College to get my MFA in fiction. And I decided when I entered the program that I wanted to work on a novel and that I would come out after the 2 years with at least a draft of a novel. So I'd gone into the program with that intention because I had never done a long piece of work. And I thought that doing an MFA would be a good opportunity to help me focus on that and work on that. In terms of the book itself, it feels like another life right now, as it's so far away. I would say I was interested in language and how language shapes identity, right? So those were the things I focused on in the book, and that I was working on in my head, trying to just kind of map out for myself how much language determines our identity. And so really, that's what the book is about. That it is historical fiction to me is just sort of, okay, it wasn't the main focus for me when I was writing.
I understand that any future fiction writing by you is sort of on hold, and that you're working on a nonfiction book. What's this book going to be about?
It's a book on body composition and how it impacts metabolic health. I was working on a nonfiction book on inflammation, but that was put on hold when a patient told me, no, I need you to write a book on all the things you tell me so I can give it to my family so they know why I'm doing all this. So that's what I'm working on in nonfiction. I do have a fiction project, and I have a lot of it done, but it obviously needs many more drafts.
Well, I wish you good fortune on your book having to do with body composition. I've for a long time been working on a book about sarcopenia avoidance, and it keeps fluctuating from a scientific book to a popular book, and I can't seem to find the sweet spot. You know, how sciencey and how accessible and how much referencing. What's the sweet spot has been difficult.
Yeah, as I've not really worked on a long nonfiction piece before. So I think I have the same challenges, although I did get the draft done in 2 weeks. And that was just, big regurg, right? First draft, I always say of anything, is primer on the wall.
It takes me 2 weeks to do a draft chapter.
Well, if you think of it as primer, it's not going to matter what you put on the page, right? Yeah.
So Vyvyane, I understand that you meditate for an hour every morning and that you're also one of those people who likes a very regular routine. So what are the other things that you like to do on a regular basis?
Well, I generally in my life, I adhere to a pretty strict schedule. Yes, I do meditate an hour in the morning, and then I work up for an hour, and then I work on mobility for half an hour. And then I get started with the rest of my day, which would involve work, medical work, writing, reading, seeing patients, obviously. I also will have dance practice in there, whether it's a class or it's practice on my own. And yeah, all my meal times are scheduled. My sleep time is scheduled. My wake time is scheduled. Very routine.
Well, we've absolutely enjoyed talking to you, Vyvyane. And after talking to you today, I definitely get a sense of why the Transform Alliance for Health lists you as the practice's chief shaman and visionary. Just our last question for you: who came up with that job title?
A shaman? You're a shaman?
Oftentimes you have these organizations and they have these job titles and nobody can figure out what they're supposed to be doing. So I just made up different job titles for my team. And the reason I like shaman was because of the classics background and a lot of interest in mythology and shamanistic practices, but also the sense of the shaman as a medicine man and, the components of spiritual and mental and physical health, right? That were all integrated. So that was the reason for that.
So Vyvyane, we've had such a fantastic time talking today. Thank you so much for joining us on STEM Talk.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Vyvyane. It was great.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Well, Ken, that was a fun conversation, and Vyvyane certainly has been on a fascinating journey. I absolutely love her story and the work that she's doing with her patients.
Yes, Don, our healthcare system, which is really a sick care system, is deeply broken. And this is one reason I've been so intrigued with Vyvyane and her medical practice in Boston, where she's having a lot of success helping people lose sometimes 50 pounds or more and getting them off their many medications.
So if you enjoyed this interview as much as Ken and I did, we invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes at stemtalk.us. This is Don Cornegas signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.